Hello, beautiful statistics people, and welcome back to another little online lesson. Today we're going to go through the experimental and observational studies packet and get the last of the theory bit and the defining of variables out of the way, and then we can actually start doing some math next week, which I'm pretty excited about. So inside of this packet, we will go a little bit more in depth regarding the structure of experiments and really define some of the key features that I think promote good experimentation and good data collection. And kind of one of the key ideas we want to chat about is this idea of explanatory and response variables. Those are the two variables we want to talk about today, and how there could be other kinds of variables that are lurking or confounding in the background. So those are our kind of big series of 4 variables we want to talk about. And then at the very end of the lesson, we're going to take a look at drawing what we call a cause and effect diagram to try to keep track of some of these variables that are in play. So an experiment essentially is a study that's designed to look at the relationship between 2 or more variables. Typically, the experiments that I've done in my lifetime typically try to do with 2, but I have seen some experiments done with more than 2 as well. And typically you want to set up an experiment in such a way that you have an explanatory variable, and the explanatory variable is sometimes called the independent variable. It's the one that you're going to be changing a little bit as the experimenter. And then what you're hoping is that as you start changing the explanatory variable, you're going to start to see a change in what we call the response variable. This is our dependent variable because it's dependent on how we change the explanatory variable. And the response variable is another one of those variables that we're going to measure, and we're kind of interested in the change that we see in the response variable as we start changing the explanatory variable. So for example, I know in class we were discussing this hypothetical study about this quitting smoking rate, or this smoking cessation rate. And we wanted to kind of compare whether or not a brochure or a pharmacist treatment would affect cessation rate. So the brochure and the pharmacist treatment, those are going to be our explanatory variables. Those are the things that we're going to manipulate. And then we're going to try to measure the response. And the response is whether or not people actually quit smoking. So I have another couple types of experiments that we could look at here. And let's take a look at whether or not what variables we think are the explanatory bit and what we think are the response bits. So, for example, in our first scenario, we have, will more bushels of potatoes be produced if the soil is fertilized more? Now, just taking a look at that question, take a moment to think about the variables that we're going to be gathering data on, and whether or not you think those variables are going to be explanatory or response. So we have 2 main variables that we're working with here. We have essentially the number of bushels of potatoes, and then we have the soil fertilization, right, or the amount of fertilization. Now, which one is explanatory? Which one is the one that we're going to vary a little bit in hopes to see a response in the other one? Well, it kind of feels intuitive to me to say that the amount of fertilization is the thing that we're going to be changing a little bit, and we're going to be checking to see if the change in fertilization affects the number of potatoes that are grown. So here we could call the fertilization amount. That could be our explanatory variable, and the number of potatoes produced would be our response. It doesn't really make sense to say, does the number of potatoes produced affect the amount of fertilization? That doesn't really make any sense, right? So it kind of feels intuitive to me to say fertilization results in fewer or more potatoes. In our second scenario, we have 6 groups of children, and the hypothesis is that the number of minutes that they spend on spelling practice per day is going to affect scores on their spelling tests. So again, take a look at the two main variables in question here and try to figure out which one is explanatory and which one is response. So which one is the one that makes more sense for us to adjust a little bit? I would say that the number of practice minutes that they do is what we're going to vary a little bit. So that would be our explanatory variable. And then we're hoping that the amount that they spend practicing actually has some kind of variation on the actual scores of the spelling tests. So the score on the spelling test would be the response that we're looking for here. Okay, so once again, the number of practice minutes being the explanatory, and the score that they get on their spelling test being the response variable. Okay, so let's move away from explanatory and response variable just for a moment, and let's kind of step back and look at the overall setup of a good experiment. So a very good experiment is going to have something called a control group. And the control group is essentially a baseline group. There's going to be no change in the explanatory variable. We're going to leave the level of the explanatory variable the same. It should be a typical amount. So for example, maybe we'll go back to the spelling test scenario, and I want to vary the number of practice minutes a little bit. Well, I'm going to say that the control group is going to be the group of children that would get the normal amount of practice spelling time that teacher would normally administer. And then maybe my other group, some of them might have more practice time, some of them might have less practice time. And then the idea is we want to compare some of those other groups to our control group to see if there is a change in their response variable. So the reason we use a control group, like in that second bullet point here, is it really just allows us to compare the different groups that we might make to the control group. And it helps us decide if the change that we've made to the explanatory variable is significant, statistically significant. And that's something that we're going to come back and explore a little bit in the very last section, in the hypothesis testing section. We're going to actually develop some ways to determine whether or not the differences that we're seeing between groups is actually significant. Now, in general, when you're working on an experiment that involves humans, you have to remember that humans suck. And I say humans suck because as soon as they know information, whether or not they mean to or not, that affects the way that they treat the experiment or the thought process they might have within that experiment. So everyone, as much as we don't want to admit it, we come with our own set of prejudices and our own set of biases. So if I know how I'm being assigned to a group, that might affect the performance that I have inside of that particular group. So for example, I know of some teachers in real life that have unfortunately created two groups inside of their classroom, and they had their kind of like group of students that tended to do very, very well on assessments, and they created a group of students that tended to not do very well on assessments. And as soon as students figured out what group they were in, it was actually quite obvious at the score changes, right? So those that were motivated within their group to do well did a little bit better, and those that kind of realized they were in the lower tier group lost a little bit of motivation towards some of the mathematics that they were doing. So this is why we typically try to blind humans when it comes to human-based experiments. And there's two different ways we can do this. We can single blind our participants or our administrators. So there's kind of a lot of experiments that I know about that use blinding are kind of pharmaceutical experiments. So they would be, for example, if we're working on a vaccination for a certain disease, for instance, maybe we want to blind just the participants. So the participants do not know whether or not they're getting the vaccine or whether or not they're getting something that's not the vaccine, that we're just pretending is the vaccine. Pardon me. So that's what we call a single blind experiment, where we just maybe blind the participants so they don't really know whether or not you're getting the vaccine or getting something else. Now, we could go one step further and we could double blind the experiment as well. So we could blind not only the participants, but we could also blind the administrators. So we could blind, for example, the pharmacists who are actually administering the vaccine or the non-vaccine, so that nobody knows what's happening. And then it's truly removing all biases from this particular experiment. So those are the two different blinding cases we could have. And like I was discussing with that particular pharmaceutical experiment, usually we have like the case where we have a vaccine and we're trying to administer a vaccine to a group of individuals, but we also have something else that's not the vaccine. And that item is often called a placebo. So this is something that looks like the regular vaccine, but it's not really the vaccine. It's just kind of like a fake thing that we're administering to our control group. So the idea here is, by making something that looks like the vaccine, we're blinding our participants. They don't know whether or not they're getting the vaccine, but everybody thinks that they are. And one odd thing that happens with a placebo is we see this interesting effect called the placebo effect, where even though individuals aren't getting the vaccine or getting the treatment that they think they're getting, they think they are. So they tend to show positive effects from the placebo anyway. So this is called the placebo effect. It's just something to keep in mind if you do go into to pharmacy and you're working on experiments in pharmacy. It's something that you could see. And that's a positive effect on the individuals in the control group just because they think they're getting the treatment. So these are the key ideas when it comes to building an experiment. So really, really good experiments will typically involve one or several of these things. It will be randomized, so we'll try to collect data in a way that's similar to some of those strategies that we saw in the last lesson. It will be comparative. Comparative in a sense that there's a control group, and then we're adjusting the experimental variable. Sorry, we're adjusting the... Try one more time. We're adjusting the explanatory variable a little bit so that we can kind of measure the response. So comparative, like I said again, looking at different groups and looking at the difference between those groups. Really great experiments typically are double blinded, so that not only the participants don't know what's going on, but also the administrators don't know what's going on as well. And that's helpful because even if the administrators know what's going on, sometimes their biases can leak into that experiment. So good experiments have blinding, especially if we're working between groups, and great experiments will be double blinded. And like I said, because we have this kind of control group, often really good experiments are going to have a placebo. So that kind of naturally blinds our participants. Okay, a couple other variables that we want to kind of quickly discuss today are lurking and confounding variables. So these are variables that may be associated with the explanatory or response variables in some way, and they tend to interfere with the way that we're able to analyze the data. So in other words, like, we tried to adjust the explanatory variable to see if there's a change in the response variable, but sometimes there's like this third variable that's kind of affecting the response in some way. And it may not always necessarily be clear how it's doing that, but it basically confuses our ability to determine whether or not the explanatory variable is actually the thing that's making the change. Hopefully that makes sense. So it just really just interferes with our ability to figure out if the explanatory is the actual variable that's causing the response. Hopefully that makes sense, like I said. Okay, so let's kind of just do a little dive into a couple scenarios to try to get you used to lurking and confounding variables. Typically, a lurking variable is associated with both the explanatory and response variables, and this is probably going to be a majority of your variables that are kind of working discreetly and secretively in the background. And like I said, they make it look like the explanatory variable is causing the change in the response variable, but that may not necessarily be the case. So, for example, I've tried to create a scenario down here at the bottom with televisions that hopefully introduce you to this idea of a lurking variable. So, countries with more TV sets per capita tend to have longer life expectancies. So obviously we should conclude that if we have more TV sets, that's what's causing longer life expectancies in these countries. And clearly that's ridiculous, right? Like the more TV sets in a country does not necessarily mean that the humans there are going to have a longer life expectancy. So there's something happening here in the background that's affecting both the explanatory and the response variable. So let's try to figure out what this is, or at least one potential answer to this problem. And the first thing we want to do is try to figure out, based on the question we have, what are the two variables that we're looking at? What's the explanatory variable and what's the response variable? So let's try to figure that out first. Let's see, we got more we have number of TV sets. Okay, so that's one of our variables. And we have life expectancy as another variable. So we think that the number of TV sets is causing a response in life expectancy. So I'm going to label life expectancy as the response variable, and the number of TV sets as the explanatory variable. Now, what we want to do is kind of just use our noggin a little bit and try to think about why that might be the case. So is there something happening in the background related to the number of TV sets and potentially also related to life expectancy? Now, it's quite possible that the countries that have higher life expectancy and a higher number of TV sets just have adequate access to good health care. So I actually should say access to. So potentially it could be that access to health care is causing higher life expectancy and is also somehow connected to the number of TV sets individuals have in that particular country. So this would be our lurking variable, our access to healthcare. It's somehow connected to the number of TV sets, obviously connected to life expectancy, and of course our TV sets and life expectancy are looking like they're connected to each other, even though there's this other variable in the background that could potentially be explaining this connection. So access to healthcare I would consider potentially our lurking variable here because it's connected to our explanatory and response variables that we're looking at in this particular scenario. Now, confounding variables are, I would say, a little bit trickier. They're not necessarily associated with the explanatory variable, or at least that's the definition that my old textbook gave to me, but they're definitely associated with the response variable. And so again, the idea with confounding and lurking variables is there's this thing happening in the background and we can't really tell whether or not the explanatory variable is causing that change in the response variable. So let's take a look at another example of these lurking and confounding variables. So we have a professor that's teaching in a subdued manner in the fall term and with more enthusiasm during the winter term. Students ended up rating him higher in the winter term. So we conclude that the difference was due to the teaching style. And that may not necessarily be the case. So first, let's again kind of look at the two variables that we're studying in this fake scenario, try to label them as the response and explanatory, and then see if we can find a lurking or confounding variable happening in the background. All right, so we have the way that the professor teaches as one of our variables, and we have the student rating also as one of our variables. Okay, so which one is explanatory and which one is response? Well, it seems as though the way the professor teaching is changing, right? We can actually see that change, and we think that that potentially is causing a response in the student rating. That would be the way that I view this scenario. So I would think that the way the professor teaching is explanatory and that the student rating would be the response. I kind of think that potentially the way the prof is teaching is leading to different ratings. So that's how these two things feel connected to me. But there's a lot of things that could be happening in the background. And specifically, I wanted to try to give you an example of a confounding variable, so something that might be related to only the response. So assuming that this professor loves all courses equally, maybe the students ended up liking certain courses more. So I would say potentially like student appeal to that course could be a potential confounding variable. Okay, so it's possible that, like I said, assuming that the professor enjoys teaching all courses equally, which is obviously not true because we all have biases, but let's assume that that's true, then it's quite possible that students will enjoy sitting in on courses more. So for example, it might, maybe one of them is an elective course that they really want to take, and one of them is a mandatory course that they have to take, aka stats. Just kidding. And that might affect the student rating as well, right? So it may not be the only thing that's affecting the student rating. I mean, certainly the way the prof teaches probably affects the student rating as well, but there could be other things in the background that could also be affecting the student rating as well. And that would be considered a confounding variable if it's only connected to the response. All right, so the last thing that we want to do in this section is create what we call a cause and effect diagram. And this diagram is essentially created just to collect all of the possible confounding and lurking variables, just so that we've taken some time to think about some of those background variables that could potentially cause a response as well. And one kind of big thing to think about as we work through cause and effect is we always want to put measurement as one branch and think about how measurement may affect our overall data as well. And we'll talk about that as we start to create a cause and effect diagram. But the idea is to try to brainstorm a bunch of different like confounding and lurking variables and then kind of collect them all under one heading. So what we're going to do is we're going to go back to our hypothetical study where we were looking at this brochure and or pharmacist kind of workshop and quitting smoking rates. So we want to see if that program delivered by the pharmacist is more effective than a brochure. And we want to kind of think about some of the things that could potentially confound our response variable. So I did a little bit of kind of brainstorming when I was creating this chapter, and I thought that maybe 4 headings that we could use could be the following. So we could talk about our subjects. We could talk about the participants who are actually joining this study, and what they bring to the table and how that might affect the way that they quit smoking. We could talk about the pharmacists that are administering the study and potentially their biases or the way that they act and how that might affect how people quit smoking. We could talk about the environment. So we could talk about factors that are, beyond our control that may affect how people quit smoking. And then finally, we always include measurement in our cause and effect diagram as well. And measurement usually comes down to thinking about things like the number of participants. So, do we have a few amount of teens that signed up for this? Do we have a lot of teens that signed up for this? Always, like, having more participants always makes your experiment or your study stronger. So the number of participants could affect our overall conclusions. So, I mean, that's something worthwhile for us to note here. We could have subjects that leave the study halfway through. So maybe after like a week or a month, they're just like, fuck this, and they leave. So that could affect our overall conclusions as well. And one other thing I had here is the brochure. So what does that brochure look like? Are there things within that brochure that somehow make it more exciting to quit or less exciting to quit? What does that look like? So I think the brochure has some kind of effect on how people are going to be quitting smoking as well. Maybe it may, or maybe it has no effect, but it's a potential confounding variable when it comes to our teens quitting smoking. Now let's take a step back. Let's try to analyze our participants. So what about our participants might have an effect on whether or not they're going to quit smoking? Well, I mean, age is certainly always a factor when it comes to our participants, right? So, people who have been smoking longer, they are going to find that harder to quit. Maybe people that have smoked less are going to find it easier. I don't really know. I've never smoked, so I don't know how difficult it is to quit when put into a program. But certainly age is going to have some kind of effect on the overall quitting smoking rate. And I also agree that potentially the sex of the individual could affect it as well, right? Whether or not they're male or female, like those kind of biological things, that could have an effect on maybe it's easier for females to quit or easier for males to quit. I don't really know. But that could have an effect on our overall rate as well. And something like I said before, I think the length or the amount of time they've been smoking, I think is really important. Right? Because certainly it's going to be a lot easier for them to quit if they've only smoked one cigarette in their life. Now, there's lots of other stuff when it comes to the participants that could have an effect on this smoking cessation rate. And a lot of those other things are going to go into the environment section. So there's lots of things like, what school they're at, what their family situation is like. Do they have parents that are smokers? Do they have friends that are smokers? So there's lots of environmental factors, I think, that are going to play a big part in the overall conclusions of our study here as well. And it's worthwhile for us to keep some of that in mind. When it comes to our pharmacists, when it comes to the people that are actually administering the study, I think their experience is going to play a really big part in how well they deliver this program. Right? Have they delivered a program like this before, or have they not? I mean, certainly their experience and their knowledge base, I think, is really important here. Oops, I spelled that incorrectly, didn't And of course, one thing that's always nice to have when you have people that are working in counseling programs is their overall demeanor, right? Are they enthusiastic? Are they excited? Are they friendly? So I think their personability or their friendliness is going to be important here as well. You're right, something that I can't really control, but certainly something that does play a little bit of part, I think, in whether or not people are going to want to stick with our program and are going to actually be motivated to quit smoking. So hopefully that gives you an idea of kind of the four big variables that we want to talk about when it comes to experiments. We have an explanatory, a response variable, and then we have these other variables that are working in the background. We call them confounding and lurking variables, and the cause and effect diagram essentially tries to capture all of the big, I would say the big confounding and lurking variables in one little snapshot, just so that we kind of have that in the back of our minds as we're designing our study. All right. So, of course, if you have any questions, please kind of just jot them down right now. Make sure that you have them ready to go when we come to our next live class next week. And I will see you guys. Let's discard the ink annotations. I'll see you guys during our next live class very soon. All right, take care, guys. Bye.